Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something called the Dieppe paradox. It's this absolutely incredible story of how one of the most staggering, devastating tactical defeats in military history actually ended up writing the blueprint for the greatest amphibious invasion ever. We're talking about high-stakes strategy, mind-blowing engineering, and the really heavy cost of learning the right and the wrong lessons in war.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's August 1942, and the aftermath of the Dieppe raid is just horrific. When German intelligence officers walked the pebble beaches of this French port, they were literally surveying a bloodbath. One German major even wrote down that he had not witnessed images more terrible. But here's the catch. As they cataloged all the destroyed Churchill tanks and the fallen Canadian soldiers, the German high command came up with a theory, and that theory hardened into an absolute certainty for them. Absolutely no army on Earth could ever supply a massive invasion force over an open beach.
And, that brings us to the ultimate question of D-Day, right? How does a German soldier sitting in Normandy on June 6, 1944, end up staring at this massive invasion fleet heading straight for an undefended stretch of open sand? To understand that, we literally have to look backwards at the wreckage of Dieppe. To really grasp how Germany's most complete tactical triumph turned into their absolute worst strategic disaster, we've got to look at the numbers.
So this raid on Dieppe, codenamed Operation Jubilee, it was supposed to be just a quick smash-and-grab test of the German coastal defenses. But, man, it was a massacre. During this 6-hour assault on the port, the Canadian forces took a staggering 60% casualty rate. 60%! Out of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who crossed the English Channel that morning, over 3,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. To this day, it remains the single worst day in Canadian military history.
And the sheer concentration of that loss, it's just hard to wrap your head around. Take the Royal Regiment of Canada, for example. The numbers here are incredibly grim. They landed at this tiny little cove called Puis and basically stepped off their landing craft right into a funnel of interlocking machine gun fire. Out of 554 men from the Royal Regiment who went into that meat grinder, only 65 survived to make it back to England. Think about that. The regiment effectively ceased to exist in less than an hour.
But here is what's truly fascinating about all this. That exact same bloody wreckage taught the Germans and the Allies two completely opposite yet perfectly rational lessons. The Germans looked at Dieppe and thought, well, an invading army of 100,000 men needs heavy harbor infrastructure to survive, so the Allies absolutely must attack a port. Their lesson? Defend the ports. The Allies, looking at the exact same battle, concluded that a frontal assault on a defended port is basically suicide. Even if you win, you just capture a bunch of rubble. So their lesson was, we cannot take a port, so we have to invent an entirely different way.
Part 1. The Atlantic Wall. Building the wrong fortress.
Let's look at how this actually played out physically across the European coastline. Because the Germans were so convinced the Allies had to capture a harbor, they kicked off the largest military construction project in occupied Europe. By the spring of 1944, they had poured a mind-boggling 17 million cubic meters of concrete into bunker complexes, submarine pens, coastal batteries, you name it. But here is the crucial detail. Hitler and his high command concentrated almost all of this heavy fortification strictly around the major ports.
And contrasting these two locations perfectly illustrates the fatal German flaw. The obvious port target, Pas de Calais, became an impenetrable fortress. They guarded it with 200,000 of their absolute best troops in the 15th Army. Meanwhile, the long, flat, open sand of Normandy, that was considered a secondary sector. Why? Because there was no port there. So Normandy got the leftovers, minimal defenses, older men, and static divisions who were basically told they were never going to see real action.
Part 2. Hobart's Funnies. Engineering a Solution. So while the Germans are busy pouring all that concrete, the Allies knew that to land on the open sand of Normandy, they had to invent a way to survive the exact same obstacles that just slaughtered them at Dieppe. At Dieppe, Churchill tanks had their tracks completely destroyed by pebble shingle. Combat engineers were cut down in the open while trying to breach seawalls by hand. And undetected buried mines just decimated the infantry. Enter Major General Percy Hobbit. He was this eccentric British commander who looked directly at the causes of those Canadian deaths and engineered some hyper-specific mechanized solutions.
These insights led to an incredible, highly specialized technological arsenal. They became famous as Hobart's Funnies. First up, to keep tanks from arriving late on those really slow landing craft, Hobart designed the DD tanks. These were Sherman tanks fitted with canvas screens and propellers that could literally swim to shore right alongside the infantry. It's crazy. Second, inspired by a Canadian engineer, they created the AVRE. This was a tank equipped with a massive mortar designed to safely blast concrete bunkers from behind heavy armor plate. This meant engineers didn't have to die out in the open. And third, the Crabs. These were tanks fitted with rotating steel chains that would violently beat the ground in front of them to detonate hidden mines, completely clearing safe walking lanes for the troops.
Now, the stark difference in these choices became tragically clear on D-Day. General Eisenhower actually offered Haubert's machines to the American commanders, but they declined almost all of them. They really believed standard combat engineers could just handle the obstacles, and because of that, American forces at Omaha Beach faced a bloodbath that was terrifyingly reminiscent of Dieppe. Men dying in the surf and engineers cut down in the open. But conversely, over at beaches like Juneau, the Canadian and British forces deployed these specialized funnies. The swimming tanks arrived right on time, the AVREs blew apart bunkers in seconds, and they punched through their sectors with remarkable speed.
Part 3. Operation Fortitude, the ultimate deception.
Okay, so having solved the beach landings, the Allies still had a massive problem. They had to keep the German armored reserves away from Normandy. To protect this super vulnerable open beach assault, they basically weaponized the Germans' own port obsession through the largest military deception in history, Operation Fortitude. By using inflatable rubber tanks, completely fake radio communications, and phantom army groups supposedly commanded by George Patton over in Kent, they pointed everything straight at the heavily fortified port of Calais. The real genius here wasn't trying to create a brand new belief. It was just confirming what the Germans already knew from Dieppe. And it worked. They successfully kept 200,000 German troops frozen at Calais, just waiting for a port invasion that was never, ever coming.
Part 4. Return to Dieppe. The price of victory.
You know, everything the Allies achieved on D-Day, right down to literally towing their own artificial mulberry harbors across the channel so they wouldn't even need a port, was paid for by the horrific sacrifices made back in 1942. And history actually provided this profoundly moving moment of closure. The completely rebuilt 2nd Canadian Division, literally the exact same division that was decimated in 1942, landed in Normandy in July 1944. They fought their way through France, and in September, they triumphantly entered and liberated the town of Dieppe. The German garrison had already fled, and the Canadians took back those exact same pebble beaches without firing a single shot.
This entire paradox is perfectly captured by Field Marshal von Rundstedt's completely ignored 1942 warning. Right after the raid, he noted that the Allies would definitely study their failure, writing, "Perhaps he will do this to an even greater extent because he has paid so dearly for it." It is a really haunting reminder that a devastating defeat, if you study it with clear eyes, can actually become the exact blueprint for victory. So I'll leave you with this final thought. When you encounter a massive failure in your own endeavors, are you simply building thicker walls like the Germans, or are you engineering a completely new way forward like the Allies?